Acaia is renowned for its premium scales. They are high-priced, highly sensitive, and of course, naturally high in quality. And now a grinder is added. A grinder that, as expected from Acaia, of course, synchronizes with a scale and, as typical for Acaia, also comes with an app. We tested everything thoroughly and discussed it in great detail on our main channel. Today, right here and now, a brief summary is going to take place. We're back with a grinder video, which is specifically a summary of a detailed and extensive review of the Acaia Orbit. A grinder that has the capability to connect with both a scale and an app. Yes, you absolutely heard that right. Some grinders now come with app functionality. This package, which includes a grinder, a scale, and an app, offers numerous features. However, when considering the entire setup, it can end up being quite pricey. The scale alone costs around €300, plus the grinder at €1,600. Together, if you buy them as a package, it's a bit cheaper, somewhere around €1,800. It really is quite a lot for a slim, small grinder that has 64mm burrs. These burrs can naturally be easily replaced here, as expected. It's compatible with SSP marking discs and accessories. Practical, yet it still remains a combo with these standard marking discs. But there are other similar grinders for significantly less money on the market, but of course without the app and without the scale and this function. And so the primary question essentially is whether, aside from the decent performance we anticipate and have indeed observed, the scale, the app, and the rotation speed setting can thoroughly justify this high price or the additional cost. Perhaps the most important thing first. We had very delicious espresso, we had very delicious filter coffee because both are made with the grinder. Absolutely possible. It positions itself as an all-purpose grinder. Even with the standard burrs, we've achieved good results. And above all, we could switch relatively flexibly from espresso to filter coffee, then effortlessly go back and quickly rediscover the appropriate grind size again. This means that the adjustability and the repeatability of the grind setting according to the recipe is impressively good. At this moment, we're at 9.2, approximately 9.25, situated here in our defined area. That's the espresso grind size. Somewhere around turning it coarser all the way around to the 7, we were then in the filter coffee range, and then we went back and the grind size was there. By the way, it was noticeable not only in the espresso flow time, but also in the particle curve, which we took a close look at as well. We can assert that the machine still performs excellently, even from shot to shot. Good and replicable results, but also manages to achieve excellent grind curves. We have a medium fine peak, and there's a relatively narrow main peak, which ensures that we can ultimately achieve those truly delicious espresso and filter coffee results in the cup that we found. Before we delve further into the functions, let's briefly discuss the key parameters we look at with all grinders. That's the noise level. We're operating at 76 decibels, and I would say that it's comfortably in the middle range. Actually quite pleasant. It's a bit uncomfortable when you switch back from filter coffee to espresso. Occasionally, there are still some coffee grounds lingering, and you can distinctly hear it in a quite unpleasant manner. Incidentally, during our observation, we happened to notice that there was a small, noticeable trail of coffee present here, which was slowly being squeezed out through the connection point between the grind area and the lower section. A bit inexplicable and not so nice, then a little film formed here. That aspect was a point we didn't quite like. However, there's very minimal retention space, which is indeed a positive thing. The grinder is not among the very best grinders because we have a certain amount of retention. We're at about 0.2, 0.3 in temporary retention and around 0.3, 0.4 in permanent retention. Right now, when you open the grinder here, you will find over time some deposits on the catchers in the permanent area. And so together we end up with a total retention of about 0.7, which is still low, especially very low compared to all dosing grinders. However, the 0.2 in the area of the temporary retention, that's not very good for us. Just good, but still okay. Well rated, and yes, if around 18 grams are added and 0.2 from the previous time are still included, it truly doesn't have any significant impact on the taste overall. The speed truly has no significant impact on the flavor. It is actually a bit slow. The grinder is really slow. When we look at the grinder's rating, overall we can say a lot is green and dark green. That indicates both good and very good. However, one is red, and that is the grinding speed. We take approximately 14 seconds to grind 10 grams of coffee to paint through here. And if we really want to paint through the 18 grams, then we need 18.5 grams. That's certainly on the slower side, there's no doubt. Some grinders are slower and more expensive, yet there are notably a lot of cheaper alternatives available, which are indeed quite a bit faster. The usability of the grinder overall is good. We have several options in operation, but the question is if they all make sense. In everyday use, the operation is very simple. You start grinding at the front here, specifically the grinding that you last set up with the app. You have the option to store 4 different APMs and assign any one of them, or default to the last used one on the app, which is always the one that will start when you simply press here. And you already notice it's relatively quiet. Of course, there are also no beans in it. If I double-click, the grinder grinds really fine and releases a bit of residue again. And if I press it 3 times, then the grinder will grind once and then will grind again in the opposite direction. And personally speaking, this is one of the most ingenious features of this particular grinder for me. And from my perspective, it might actually be worth a few €100 as well. Of course, we can certainly argue about that. But in any case, she does something exciting, because through this back and forth movement, something from the retention detaches again and then falls out. And then it is no longer hidden somewhere in the grinding chamber. I think this is a feature we will see more and more in the future. It's undoubtedly quite smart. You have the ability to operate it quite easily from the outside at this particular point. And then we can, of course, go into the app, and in the app we can then set different RPM speeds, meaning rotations per minute. Potentially higher speeds when grinding espresso, and perhaps opting for slower settings when it comes to grinding filter coffee. Also combinable and then also connectable is the scale. But before we get to that, maybe just very briefly, let's take the scale away. A portion of the retention space, which I haven't yet talked about, is actually situated back here in the rear section within this compartment. When coffee gets in there, so we put coffee on top, let's say 18 grams, and grind it through, then the grinder performs this back and forth grinding motion to effectively release more of the remaining coffee powder. But then there's still something left back here. To resolve this, you absolutely need to operate this little clicker here to get this part into the dosing cup. Otherwise, you have much more retention. So that's an essential function. So far, so good. Without a scale, just Acaia. It wouldn't be Acaia if they didn't include a scale somewhere. And then we get to the problems that start there, and to the question, does all of this really make sense? First, we really have to carefully thread this cup in here quite a bit. It doesn't actually fit properly anymore. We can simplify this process significantly by removing or taking out this lower section right here. But with this approach, the powder simply won't center as well. Additionally, there's another issue to consider. The grinder tends to gather a significant amount of static charge, and often typically requires a water spray to effectively help reduce the static charge. So, with that and connected, the scale allows us to use the entire grinder with scale as a grind by weight grinder. So, we can add more coffee at the top here, though not much fits in, and unfortunately there's still no larger bottom container available. So it's really a question if the whole thing would work as a grind by weight grinder. But in theory that should work. However, we encounter failure at the subsequent step. We've now managed to successfully thread the dosing cup into its designated place. After a few attempts, we've finally connected the scale. And we're starting now, initiating the grinding process, and we very precisely grind our target result once more. Let's say around 17 grams, more precisely 17.3 grams. However, we've encountered a small problem. It tends to stop as soon as the target amount is reached within the scale itself. The issue emerges once again. The central problem is really that approximately 0.7 grams remain trapped up there. And those aren't factored in at all when the scale halts its operation based on the completed result recorded in the dosing container. That's why we usually end up with too much here. 7/10, 8/10 of a gram. And then you really have to ask yourself, what's the point of all this if today's modern dosing grinders with time control function accurately to 0.1 or 0.2 grams. My expectation, at least for a grinder with a scale, would be that it can accomplish the whole thing more precisely. Here we are far from that precision. In fact, we're dealing with a difference of 0.7, 0.8 grams. Yes, absolutely inaccurate. And that's certainly not something we would expect from a contemporary, modern and intelligent grinder, essentially like the Acaia Orbit we have here. That brings us to the conclusion. If you'd like to explore further and gather more information, you can choose to watch our detailed video, review the extensive test report, and there is also an English summary available for the grinder. That concludes our segment on the Acaia Orbit. Do share your thoughts and feedback in the comments. If you appreciate short formats, consider subscribing to the channel. Otherwise, until we meet again next time, take care and enjoy some delicious espresso.